Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yasmina Greco. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and I will be your host for today's webcast. Today, folks, we have Tynan Sylvester, and he's going to be talking to you about drunk design, game design under the influence of emotions. Tynan has been designing games for 12 years. During that time, he has worked on everything from independently produced games to the big studio blockbuster BioShock Infinite. We're really excited to have Tynan with us today to present this webcast for you all. As we get things started, I'd like to go over a little housekeeping to help you get the most out of today's webcast. You'll want to open your group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we can interact with each other during the event and where you can submit your questions for Tynan. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you all to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Tynan, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that they're for him and we can make sure we see it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you'd like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you might need to give it permission to access your account. It will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And today our hashtag is Game Design, all one word. If you should have any trouble during the event, please take a look at your help widget. If you continue to have problems, just post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is to close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know we are recording today's webcast, and we'll have the archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Tynan for his presentation. Hello, Tynan.
Well, thank you very much, Yasmina, and thank you, all of you guys, for coming, and thanks to O'Reilly for putting this together and for publishing the book. Today I wanted to talk about game design, and specifically I wanted to talk about how the fact that you're all drunk really influences the process that you might take when you're doing game design, because we are drunk, right? I think it's not totally incorrect to say we're pretty much hammered all the time for our entire lives, from when you get up in the morning to when you're interacting with your friends, when you're at work, when you're coding, when you're in a design meeting. You're drunk, and I don't mean alcohol drunk necessarily. What I mean, of course, is emotions. So, your brain is just this pile of neurons sitting in this bath of chemicals inside your skull, and those chemicals really affect it. Your testosterone will shoot up one day at some moment, and then you'll just want to try something crazy and aggressive or make some sort of violent competitive game. Or for whatever reason, your oxytocin will spike up, and then for no logical reason, you're going to want to talk things over or make a game that's about connecting and nurturing. Or something bad happens and their cortisol goes up, and suddenly you can't think, and your creativity shuts down, and you're stressed out, and everything seems like a threat or an insult. And this is just part of human life, and that's something we've got to deal with, and that's what I want to talk about. So this talk is called Drunk Design, Game Design, Under the Influence of Emotions, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm Tynan Sylvester. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I came from. A long time ago, I used to be into level design. I started just doing levels for Unreal Tournament way back in the day. These are a couple of them. This one is called Light Falls, Night Falls. Over time, I kept doing that over the years. I was still in school. I moved on to mod design. We actually made a total conversion mod where we took Unreal Tournament 2003 and recreated it into this sort of futuristic Counter-Strike thing that we called Elemental Conflicts. We had a team of 6, 7 people, and it took about a year, and we actually made this thing and released it, and it went nowhere, although I was pretty proud of it. But that was my lesson in market positioning, because Counter-Strike was already there, and they had crushed us before we even started. So that was a fun time. Time went on. Technology got better. Here's a level I made of Hong Kong back in the day. I mostly put up levels because they're prettier. And then in 2008, I was hired by Irrational Games. And the first thing I worked on was the downloadable content for BioShock, which had just been released. So I did one of the puzzle levels for that, kept working at Irrational. And then the big one is BioShock Infinite, which is coming out later this month. And I didn't work on it for the last year, but I hope you guys will all check it out because I think it's going to be a great game. But while I was there, worked on the game for about 3 years. For the first part doing level design, and then later I was doing systems design as well. And then most recently, I've returned home to Canada and finished up this book that I've had published with O'Reilly. It's designing games. It's an exploration of a lot of concepts which will help people think about game design problems, and game design process, which is actually what I want to focus on today, is the actual day-to-day process of how you're designing games, and specifically the internal process of how you're thinking about the games that you're designing and how your feelings are going to influence that. So the stuff I'm talking about today is not from the book. There's a few minor overlaps, but I'd already written that stuff, so I needed something new to keep myself interested. So I do encourage you guys all to check out the book and get 2 or 3 copies because it makes great kindling, or it'll stabilize the wobbly table if you need that too. So totally take a look. So back to the actual topic. So oftentimes I think that our default position when it comes to game design is to discuss it as though people are essentially some sort of biological computer, and the game design process is an algorithm. The basic assumption is that, well, if you just know what to do in any given situation, then you're going to be a good game designer. You're going to be able to know when to play test and how. You're going to be able to know when to increase the difficulty of something or change an interface widget. Just knowing the answers to the problems, knowing how to move your hands on the keyboard and what button to press and what words to say. And I call this kind of thing outer skill because it's on the surface of you. It's what you're doing with yourself externally. But it says nothing about what happens inside you. Here's an example of a quotation from an article, like a typical game design article discussing outer skill. So once you have an idea of how many decisions the player is making and what they are, you can begin by evaluating those decisions. Consider each decision point separately and determine how difficult each decision is and how likely it is to recur. If the decision is easy, it is worth little. If it recurs a lot, it becomes easy, and blah, 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 blah. Of course, that's me. I'm talking about decision-based gameplay design from an article I wrote a few years ago. And I think that kind of logic is pretty valuable, right? Like, outer skill is necessary. We need to know what to do in these situations. But when you get right down to it, we can't always or even often execute this kind of logic because we don't work this way. We're not Data with the pipe in his mouth. We're not perfectly logical computer-like beings. We can't program ourselves with an algorithm to solve game design. And I'm going to explore that more later. What we really are is this guy. We're crime data. We're emotional data. We got the emotion chip. And so much of human thought is emotional. It's just crazy to ignore all that. I discovered this more and more since I started doing serious indie game development in 2012 after I left Irrational while I was working on the book. The difference between studio work and independent work is that when you're at a studio, you have this entire social structure to stabilize you and keep you focused on whatever goal it puts in front of you, whether that goal is worthwhile or not. If you come into work feeling doubtful or feeling overexcited or depressed or distracted or whatever, it doesn't affect you too much because the system will get you on track. And that's what those studio organizational structures are great for. But when you're developing independently, you're pretty much naked. You have no stabilizing structure around you to hold you on the path that you need to be. And so it makes you vulnerable to your feelings. And that's something I've been noticing more and more as I've been vulnerable to the emotions that I've been feeling in game design. I've been unable to execute the algorithm of game design that I had been learning for so long, as well as I thought I could. and they got me. And I'm going to talk about my failures, or my hilarious failures later on. So basically, outer skill is not enough. We also need to develop inner skills. Because inside our brain we have this collection of emotional impulses, and we need to be able to understand them and handle them towards our development goals. And it's not even about fighting them, it's about handling yourself. So I'm going to talk about 3 games I developed, or prototypes I developed in the last year, and some of the inner skills that I learned from each. So the first one was one I called Animus, and the inner skill element I'm calling the Doubtful Pug. So here's a video of it. There we go. So I actually videoed this thing every single day, or almost every day while I was developing it, just one by one. So you're going to see it developing bit by bit. So the basic concept of the game is that it's a top-down action game where you control one character on a field of contest, and you're trying to place towers and use abilities to get your guys into the enemy's base and prevent him from getting his guys into yours. So there's a pathfinding test with all his guys coming towards my home base. And now you can see I've got my guys going towards him, so we're trading blows over the field where he's got his creeps and I've got my creeps. And he's got his defense towers and I have mine. So it's essentially two-way tower defense with characters. So there's going to be a lot of axes of conflict here. Like you could be combating against the enemy Animus character. You could be combating against his towers. He could be combating against your creeps. All those relationships are there. The second part that was supposed to be unique about this game, and this was just a prototype, was the music element, and you can see that here. It was supposed to synchronize with music. So if any of you guys played Audio Surf, in that game you have an audio or a racetrack, and you play a song, any song from your library, and when the song gets exciting, then the track tilts downwards and you're blasting at high speed. And when the song slows down, suddenly the track is going upwards and you're just sort of rolling along slowly at a relaxed pace. And the intent with Animus was to do something similar where you'd play the song, and then when the song keyed up, you would, all the enemies would move faster and your characters would move faster, the fires would become more dangerous, the entire game would suddenly become more aggressive. And then when it slowed down, everything would just chill out. And so you'd get those emotions that you felt with your music, just listening to it, amplified by the pacing of the game, which followed them along. So I actually had a tool here that I could mark up songs with pacing. You can see the graph at the bottom of the screen there. Here I'm putting on fire. By now I've developed a lot of different spells. There's chaser enemies who come after me. That's the lawnmower thing that when their creeps get to your base, you don't just instantly lose. It clears half the map for you, which gives you a bit of a moment of relaxation. And then finally, I really wanted to develop the whole thing in gray box as far as I could, which means to leave it without art assets and just discover what is effective in terms of the mechanics design. But at the end of it, I was actually putting some art in, and it turns out that doing good beam effects and magic effects actually takes a really long time. It would take me like an entire day to do a heat beam design when it would take me the same amount of time to code like a navigation system. So yeah, that was Animus. And the details of the game aren't that important. What I'm really interested in with regards to this talk is how I responded to it emotionally and how that affected me in my design process. At the end of it, I ended up giving up on Animus, partly because I didn't want to do the year of work that the Audio Surf guy told me he had to do to code a piece of software that would read a piece of music and determine the psychological pacing of it, because that wasn't the problem I wanted to solve. But I could have avoided that problem if I had removed or redesigned that element. Really, I gave up on Animus entirely because I didn't feel good about it. I had this little voice in my head telling me that it wasn't going to work. And I call him the doubtful pug. He would say things like, oh, it's not going to work. It doesn't feel good. He'd say, don't throw good time after bad. Or he'd say, harumph. Like, I would pick up this game and I would play it. And it just felt utterly pointless to me. So pointless. it seemed like the same things would happen over and over. I would click the mouse. I got no emotional reaction to it at all. And I was accustomed to playing games that were good. Like you'd play a game and you'd really feel something from it. Even back when I worked on shooters, there was always an element of self-entertainment, even with a piece of design that I had seen many times before. It felt better than this. But this one just felt terrible. But then something strange happened when a couple months ago, long after I'd stopped working on Animus, just recently, an old friend of mine came back to town, and I was showing him the old games I'd worked on, the old prototypes, and I showed him this one, and we ended up having a great time with it. Both of us. I mean, it was still buggy and poorly balanced, but he was playing it. He wanted to play again. I wanted to play again. We were laughing. It was fun. So this kind of thing happens to all of us, right? It's the same stimulus, but your perception of what you're looking at is reversed. And you consider life, say you have like a romantic partner who's deified and then vilified on some other time, or fear can turn a normal person into just very defensive, possibly violent, almost psychopathic kind of character if someone's afraid enough. Or something as simple as hunger, in my family they have a saying that people get hangry, where to describe the phenomenon where people get irritable when they're hungry. So just that low blood sugar makes someone perceive an innocuous comment as some sort of insult or jibe that has to be responded to. So it's the same thing, but you're perceiving it differently each time, and this extends to game design and perceiving your own games. And to me this is scary, because it means that you can't trust your own mind. How can I execute a design strategy if I can't even coherently perceive what I'm looking at the same way from day to day or from hour to hour? Any design algorithm that I could learn, any outer skill that I could have would break down if 2 plus 2 can equal 5 or 10 or 22 or 11, depending on my emotional state. You can't run a computer if the computer is doing different things on a daily basis. So that was really the thing that made me start thinking about emotion deeply in game design. And I'd always been aware that emotions could change judgment. Everybody is. For a long time I thought you should just ignore these kinds of feelings, right? I valued just crystalline logic over every other form of thought. In my view, feelings were this burden on thinking, this sort of side path to be avoided or ignored or suppressed. But over time I realized that just ignoring your feelings as a game designer doesn't work, because first off, you actually can't logic yourself past every feeling. Even logical decisions, and especially complex ones like the ones that we make when we're designing games, depend on intuition, and your intuition is twisted by your emotion. I think we have to be a little bit humble and understand the fact that our judgment will change on days of different moods, and there's nothing we can do about that. You're going to perceive something as good or bad or entertaining or boring for reasons that have nothing to do with what's being perceived, but have to do with the context or the state you're in when you come at it. And the second reason you can't just ignore feelings is because suppressing your emotions really takes a toll. It increases stress. It wears down your mind and your capacities. And over time, that kind of stress, makes people irritable. It means you can't focus. It means that wellspring of ideas you have will run dry. So we need those inner skills. You have to deal with emotions. You have to sense it and know what it is, and you have to dance with it and flex with it and peek past it to see where you're going or direct it to get where you want. We're going to be influenced by feelings. You just don't have to be blindly influenced by them. Because emotions they're not faults. They're signals and they're tools, and that emotional intuition can be super powerful if we really key into it and learn how to use it, which is something that I struggle to do. So the next game I'm going to talk about is another prototype. These are like a month and a half each that I'm working on these prototypes. The first one was Animus and the Doubtful Pug, which made me stop working on it. And the second one is one I call Survival Stories. So I'll describe this one to you. So I stopped working on Animus, and this was my immediate follow-up to that, the next project that I was like, maybe I'll do something else, and I'm going to try this one. So the basic concept was a little bit like the game STL, if any of you guys know it, which didn't exist yet, mixed with zombies. So you'd have a small group of characters. They would proceed through various randomly generated encounters on randomly generated levels and try to survive the zombie outbreak. So the intent was you'd have this sort of ragtag band of survivors who would maybe encounter someone new, lose someone else. Two of them are brothers, and one of those gets zombified, the other one gets crazy as a result. You'd find a weapon that was really useful and then lose it. And here you can see me developing all the very early terrible versions. There's house generation, which looks awful and then looks slightly better as I improve the algorithm. This is how I organize all my notes, just a giant Word file, which works great when you're working alone or in very small groups. Just the priority queue with the highest priority stuff at the top. Here's this thing exploding and killing a bunch of zombies. So this game had a lot of promise, I thought. Here's the inventory. Take a look at that because it's going to change. I can't even count how many inventory systems we've designed in the last year or so. I think it must be 5 or 6 because it seems to keep coming up, but the parameters are always different. Here you can see the zombies are able to get into the house. They're beating the guy up, and finally he panics, and then they take him down. Here I've got doors in finally. They're the wrong size. Now the doors are working properly, and the zombies are outside smashing and then trying to get in. So you're trying to get that zombie moment where the people are stuck in the house and the zombies are beating on the doors. Here's the redesigned inventory system. As you can see, it looks better, but not completely so. Here's the redesigned overworld map without massive numbers of overlapping pieces. And then finally, this is pretty much where it was in the end game. So I have a guy goes inside the house because zombies are chasing me, closes the door. They start coming through the windows. Zombies coming through windows was one of the last things that I programmed. Then he hides in a little room, but he's got no weapon, so he's going to get killed. So when I started out envisioning survivor stories, I went into this sort of happy frenzy. I remember I was lying in bed and I was furiously writing notes about it, almost like sort of an over-creative child at drawing time. And that's just some of the notes that I had. I thought the game was going to be awesome, right? You're going to have these dramatic starvation moments and these last-minute saves and these tearful dramas when husband has to kill the zombifying wife. And so that was great. My optimism, that feeling, drove me to this level of productivity far beyond those in normal office work. I was putting like 12 hours a day into this bad boy and having a good time at it and making great progress, and everything was moving fast, and it felt like it was success in the making. So in hindsight, I recognize that this impulse, this like hyperactively creative desire to make something because you believe in it so much, I'm calling that the hyperactive puppy and symbolizing it with this little mutt here. The puppy is that force that makes you super crazy motivated, and maybe even a little bit manic. It's a little bit like the manic phase of bipolar disorder. I actually looked it up on a whim, and this is the part of the Wikipedia description of bipolar disorder, or the manic part, is individuals may behave erratically and impulsively, often making poor decisions due to unrealistic ideas about the future, underline that, and may have great difficulty with sleep. So that sort of happy excitement, like that's a studied piece of psychology, and it affects you. It feels good and makes you super motivated, but it can also affect your judgment. A month and a half later, I prototyped Survival Stories, and once again, the doubtful pug came back, and I felt pretty much the same about it as I did about Animus the first time around. It just felt pointless. I felt like I spent most of my time in the game walking my characters around empty houses, picking stuff up, shuffling inventory around. The human interactions that did happen felt mechanical and meaningless. So ultimately, I stopped working on that prototype as well. So what happened ultimately? The hyperactive puppy deluded me into thinking the game was better than it was, and the doubtful pug did the opposite. It was this sort of up and down emotional wave that pushed me to make this game and then pushed me to stop. Hyperactive puppy gives you a vision. It comes with a vision, but I think that you pay attention to vision. The mechanism of vision is not a very good one, or not a very accurate one, because vision is seductive. It lies to you through your emotions. I think in reality there are an infinity of game ideas that are just as good as anything I came up with survivor stories. But just that mental picture of it drove my hyperactive puppy crazy and just made me super motivated. So what happened? I want to talk about vision because I think it's something that we rely on so much, but it deceives us constantly. So as a little exercise for everybody out there listening, try just thinking about the last week of your life and just envision that in your head. And it will help you if you actually do this. It only takes a few seconds. Think about what happened and just go through it. So you probably got a picture of it in your head. What I'm guessing is that you didn't end up envisioning brushing your teeth before bed or driving to work the same way you do every day for the last 3 years or however long. You probably envisioned the most interesting and compelling moments. You probably envisioned just a couple periods of maybe even just something like 30 seconds each. Like, if someone was injured, that would be the thing you'd envision, even if it only took a few seconds. Or if you kissed someone for the first time, that would be something you envisioned, even though, once again, only a few seconds. And that's just a tiny proportion of the experience of that entire week. And that happens to us when we envision games as well, because vision skips the boring parts. And that's how the mechanism of vision works. Your mind wants to go to the most salient details, so it's not going to go through whatever you're envisioning chronologically. It's going to skip the pieces and essentially give you a highlight reel. And that's how it seduces you. So if you imagine, say, a video game experience on a graph in terms of how compelling it is, it might look something like this. This is a little bit like what survivor stories look like. It wasn't very good because most of the time it's just sitting down there at the bottom. You can see it starts out, and something interesting happens, but then it sort of muddles around. Nothing very compelling is going on. And then, there's another spike of interest and excitement, but then it falls back down, and then time goes on. So when I envisioned survivor stories, all I saw was those little boxed squares. All I saw were the highlight reels. And that deceives you and seduces you, or at least seduced me, into feeling like that was all the game was. What actually turned out to occur when I built the game was that most of the time was spent in the bottom in those troughs of disinterest. So my vision deceived me. My hyperactive puppy deceived me. It gave me information that wasn't correct. It gave me a game that was a highlight reel and pretended that it was the entire thing. So there are antidotes to this. First is to just know that it's happening. But second is there's actually a process that I've started using to try to fight back against this. I call it disciplined envisioning. So instead of, when you want to envision a game, instead of envisioning it casually, just in moments, you're just going to get the highlight reel if you do that. Try sitting down and scheduling out a few minutes and actually envisioning the game in real time. And it's kind of uncomfortable to do this. It feels strange to actually sit there and count the clock seconds through the gameplay as you're going. But what you might notice is those periods of time when, hey, wow, there's a lot of empty walking that you have to do to get up to this encounter, or there's a lot of rote management of inventory that you have to do to finally, before this dramatic moment occurs. That's the kind of disciplined envisioning that can actually get you better information about the potential game design that you're thinking about. Another way of doing it is just to try to envision the most boring, the worst parts of the game. Instead of envisioning what comes naturally, which is going to be the best parts, just envision the worst. Try to make it as bad as possible in your brain. Once again, this is uncomfortable. It's cognitively difficult, but you're going to get a different kind of information than with casual envisioning. So at the end of the day, I think we need the hyperactive puppy because he's the reason we do this. He's our source of motivation, and I think he's the thing that drives a lot of us into game design. And people who don't have this guy in their brains, they just don't have the motivation to make these games. So we need him, but we can't believe him. So at the end of the day, I think you've got to recognize that impulse, that hyperactive puppy, and feel him when he's inside you, and do a bit of double think where you use him as a source of motivation so that you can get into that hyper-productive state like I was at the start of my work on survival stories. But don't use him as a source of information because he's a lying, deceiving, seductive bastard. And he's going to tell you things that are not accurate. He's going to give you the highlight reel. If you want information, use disciplined envisioning. So that was survival stories. The next one was Wizard University, which we will now take a look at. All right, so I've gone full 2D here because I don't want to deal with 3D production because I don't have the assets to make that work. The basic concept of this game is essentially a management simulator for sort of a Hogwarts-like educational institution where kids would go to learn wizardry. So you'd have dormitories for them, you'd have professors you'd hire, they'd go to classes, and they would maybe do experiments, maybe they'd screw up and a dragon would pop out, and then you'd have to have some sort of security arrangements to deal with that. There's a lot of Dwarf Fortress in this game, although without the insanely difficult to use ASCII interface. But it was intended to be pretty much a simulation level or simulation depth a model of what this kind of institution might be like. So here everything's going at super fast speed. If you're wondering why these characters are flicking around, here you can build floors, and here's the hiring interface, which is way too complicated. I don't know why I'm giving people so much data about these people they could hire. I should have just let you hire guys and have them generate it automatically. Here I've got a bit of world gen in, and your guys can go and mine out the walls and build buildings or build rooms inside. Guys can get injured now. I've got the whole injury system. I had money. They have to carry stacks of money back and forth to spend. Okay, what else is going on? Here's the world gen's improving. Now there's I got grass, I got trees. Here we're digging out, and here we have dudes going insane when their morale gets too low. They just go crazy and go on killing sprees. So here's one of them killing the other, and the other one not responding at all because there's no coded response. And finally, you've got a bandit who takes a few shots on the way in from my defense cannons, but then proceeds to murder one of my characters in their sleep. So that was how far Wizard you got. I won't go into the design so much. I want to talk about my process of how I ended up working on, or how I worked on Wizard University. And I worked on Wizard University over the summer, and I discovered that life really affects work because it affects your emotional state. Because game design basically starts when you get up in the morning, not when you sit down at your computer or your notebook. I had a very drama-filled summer for foolish reasons. It was a kind of bad idea situation that everyone gets involved in every now and then, or at least some of us. Good times and bad ones. And sometimes interpersonal drama ended up really deeply affecting my work. This really manifested mostly as this closing of what I call the natural wellspring of ideas. There were weeks when I was supposed to be working full-time on the game and I could get almost nothing done, like literally almost nothing. I would sit down at the PC and try to focus and only have my mind stolen away elsewhere by something else it wanted to think about. So basically this dog with the distraction was inside me, and I call him the distracted mutt to go alongside the doubtful pug and the hyperactive puppy. This distracted mutt makes you think about the wrong things. To me, his effect is greatest when I'm falling asleep. This is the time when I personally come up with new ideas because my normal status is just lay in bed waiting for sleep to come. And naturally, whatever I'm working on will just mull through my brain. And these thoughts will just bubble around and bump into each other. And every now and then, they'll come up with some new idea or some new connection that I didn't see before. And I'll write it down in my phone or in a notebook and wake up the next morning and explore it. But during this period in the summer, this didn't happen. That wellspring of ideas, which just naturally occurred, was closed. I found myself unable to direct my creative mind where I logically wanted it to work. Because I think that the best creative thinking can't be controlled and directed, inherently so. Because in creativity, the mind has to roam. It has to explore these nooks and crannies of possibility without restriction, because restrictions just force you back into solutions you already know about. So to explore freely, though, your mind has to be going somewhere useful of its own accord. If it's drawn away from your work by worries of something else or some kind of drama or something else you're trying to deal with in your life, you become incapable of creative thought because your free-roaming mind is going to the wrong places. And if you force it back on what you're trying to think about, then you won't be able to have creative ideas because you're only thinking, you're only able to force it onto things that you already know. And it won't be able to roam somewhere new and useful. The opposite of this period of that summer was the period just after I returned to Ottawa because I didn't have many friends in town. Life was pretty much empty except for work, but God was I productive. I'd work on the book and just think about nothing else. And I'd work like a dog. My entire mental life was revolving around this book. But I was essentially sort of this guy. I was like the hermit developer. It wasn't a sustainably happy existence. Like a lot of us, I can handle solitude. I love the work that I do, but it's not something you can do forever. It's just to be alone with your computer. I think as a human, it's a recipe for deathbed regrets. So what do you do, right? I mean, this kind of creates a dichotomy. On the one hand, you can have all sorts of interesting things going on and challenges in your life, or you can be a workaholic hermit. The first case, you're going to be distracted and your mind's going to be stolen away from you. In the second case, you're going to be super productive, but basically alone and feel a little bit pointless or feel the whole thing is a little bit pointless. Ultimately, there's no answer that solves this completely, this dichotomy here. I think it's something or a decision that we each need to make. Sometimes it's worth just emptying your life out to a degree just to get something done. Some things are worth, giving up time to travel or to experience real life challenges and victories. If you want to focus on creating something, but other times it might be might be better to spread yourself out a little bit. Just recognize the cost of that, because just because you're not taking time away from your work doesn't mean that you're not taking your mind away from your work, because your mind's working all the time. What it's working on is the question, and that's determined by your lifestyle. So just to recap it all, I've pretty much been screwing this up the whole time, obviously. It's just been failure, failure, failure. Animus, I was worried about the tech burden from the music, and Doubtful Pug got me, and I cut it. Several stories. I was initially seduced by the vision, but then Doubtful Pug got me again, so I dumped that one. And finally, Wizard University, where pretty much the same stuff happened with an extra spicing up of massive dramatic distractions from real life. So I eventually freaked out and cut that one as well. As I stand here, or as I'm talking to you, I'm pretty sure that the dogs were throwing me off. I could have redesigned the zombie game or the wizard game piece by piece to work better. They would have changed drastically. I might have made major shifts. I might have changed from, say, generated houses to drawing from a library of content for the zombie game, or from pseudo 3D to pure 2D, or whatever. But there were ways to solve the problems that I used as my logical excuses to stop worrying about these games, or to stop working on these games. And this sort of made me realize, like looking back at these experiences, made me realize how much we are, as people, are not evolved to handle this kind of challenge. You and I and everybody, we're the guy on the left. We're a caveman. Our emotional instincts are tuned to deal with the problems that guy had, which tended to be short range. They tended to be hands-on. They tended to give feedback for success or failure in a way that game design doesn't. Game design is something else. Game design, you're dealing with a complex system. You're dealing with market dynamics and economics if you're designing a multiplayer game, and you're dealing with technology and the personalities and psychologies of countless players who you've never even met and never will. And you're making investments in a design that won't pay off or won't ever clearly pay off for months or years. This is really difficult to deal with emotionally because your emotions aren't made for that. Your emotions are going to tell you something's wrong, even if it's not, or tell you something's right when you're making mistakes, as with the hyperactive puppy. So here's the basic takeaways. The first is introspect. It's not all about outer skill, right? You got to know what you're feeling because it's going to affect how you work. So get to know your feelings in your body and get to know how they affect your mind. You got to learn your own personal emotional makeup so that you can handle it better because your feelings are at least half your thought process. When you're deciding whether a design is going to work or not, you're going to come up with logical reasons that describe it. But really, all that is driven, the fuel behind that reasoning is how you feel about it. You can become better at perceiving your own emotions. They're physical, you know. You know the sensation of butterflies in the stomach. You know the sensation of that sort of excitement, that vibrating power in your shoulders or in your legs when you're ready to move, or that feeling of despair that just puts a weight on all your limbs. So if you pay attention to what you're feeling over time, you can learn to pinpoint what exactly those emotions are at any moment. And the next thing you're going to be able to do if you do that is calibrate and compensate. So by that I mean that our emotions are not tuned for the task that we've undertaken in game design. They're tuned for the caveman lifestyle, as I was saying. But they are still consistent. So you might learn that if you pay attention to what you're feeling over time, say you feel that at one point, one day, that what you're creating is a failure. Your doubtful pug sticks his head out and is like, this is not going to work. And say you don't pay attention to him for whatever reason, or some social structure pushes you along and you finish working on the game. And then it turns out it wasn't a failure. You were actually doing fine. You'd look back at that and say, so I had that emotion. I paid attention to it. I identified it at the time. But ultimately, it turned out to be incorrect in that circumstance. That's a piece of information that you can use next time to calibrate your response to the doubtful pug when he rears his little head once again. So next time you're working on another game, you feel, oh, that feeling of failure comes back. You might be able to recognize that, hey, last time I felt this, it wasn't actually true. The naive interpretation of that sinking, vaguely sick sensation in my gut is that this isn't working. But no, that's just a physical sensation that happens because I'm a caveman. It's not telling me the truth. It's telling me something. It's telling me something consistently. But I've learned to calibrate against it because I knew it turned out differently than what it felt like it was going to. And that goes all over the place, especially for feelings like the hyperactive puppy, right? You're always going to feel like it's going to be amazing. This game is going to be incredible. But once you've felt that a number of times and then seen the actual results, you'll be able to calibrate that emotion. Like, yes, I feel this, but I also understand that if I calibrate this based on my past experiences with it, I know it's not actually pointing at the crazy positive outcome that it feels like it is. And so if you can calibrate and compensate after introspecting and understanding what you're feeling, you'll hopefully be able to make better development choices. Last one is, this is just simple stuff. Use tricks, that driven emotional state that the hyperactive puppy pushes you into. There's ways to try to amplify that. So, for example, music is one that I really love. Music gets me going. Some people don't like it as much. Whatever works for you, though. Just find those daily little tricks that can squeeze another couple percent out of your productivity or your mood. Because how you feel really matters. Find a way to make yourself feel good, whether it's food or someone who makes you feel better, or music, or a piece of art, or a game. And a final one is small wins. I just really want to recommend this book. It's called The Progress Principle by this Harvard lady named Teresa Amabile. She talks about how, once again, the whole caveman concept, we're not calibrated to be motivated by goals that are 6 months or a year away, these giant goals. It's not something that we're capable of keying off of emotionally. So what you do instead is you split your work up into tiny little pieces that you can accomplish on a 1 or 2 hour basis. And then when you get those tiny little wins, like one tiny little half feature accomplished, and you get to scratch that off your to-do list, that little bit of success, if you introspect, you'll feel the positive emotion you'll get from it, and that emotion is fuel. And if you can split your work up and get small wins constantly, every couple of hours at least, that'll fuel your motivation. So that's something that I found really effective for me is not to try to work only against long-term goals. Is really just to learn to enjoy seeing your page count go up at the end of the day, or even during the night. I wrote for 1 more hour and I got 1 more page out. I feel good about that, so I can write for 1 more hour more. And the last one is avoid drama and stay away from Craig girls, because that will distract you quite a bit. And that was my mistake. So, yeah, that's the end of the talk. I'm Tynan Sylvester once again. That's the book. I hope you guys will all check it out. It's on O'Reilly. And I believe they'll be selling it at a discount to you guys. You can check me out. I tweet at Tynan Sylvester occasionally. And my website is tynansylvester.com. So, Yasmina, I think I'm pretty much done for here if you want to talk.
Super. Thank you so much, Tynan. What a fantastic and really fascinating webcast. Thank you. We do have several questions from the audience that has come in, as you can imagine. So, folks, we are at Q&A now. If you do have a question for Tynan, please open that group chat widget, type it in, send it in, and he'll answer as many as we have time for. And if you're ready, Tynan, I will start with a question from Andre. He would like to know, in the videos that you were showing us, what IDE or tool was used for the games?
All right. This was Unity, which I have found, it's very popular nowadays and well advertised, and a lot of people talk about it. So I found it very effective. I did indie game development as well in a similar way 4 years ago during the period just before I worked for Irrational. And it's a lot quicker with modern tools, especially Unity. So I develop with Unity and C#. They really speed up my process. I recommend you guys check them out. It's a great product.
Super. Okay, next question here from Suris. Does Tynan do any testing with users and evaluate the emotional response of the users to the games?
Yes, thank you for that one. That's a good thing to mention. I really believe in playtesting very strongly, and playtesting not in terms of bug testing, but as you say, evaluating users' emotional response, because it does take you out of the loop. And I think that is potentially a very good antidote for some of the emotional instability that I was suffering from. However, with those games in that situation, and this might have been a mistake, I was not testing against real users because I didn't feel the game was far enough along that there was a ton of uncertainty on my part in terms of what was wrong with it. But in general, I do believe in testing against real people quite a bit and doing it systematically and carefully adjusting your testing protocol and your sample size to try to understand what people are feeling. And more recently, I have been doing more of this in recent times to try to get some actually useful information that isn't from me and try to see how real people feel about the game. But yeah, I think potentially that's a really good antidote for this sort of thing is if try to get your game to a point where somebody can play it as fast as possible, because there is a point before which just other people can't even play the game at all, and then see how they feel about it. But that's tricky, especially when you're working in gray box. As a designer, one of our skills is to try to see through missing pieces in the design and imagine what it should feel like when it's finished, but you give it to a naive user, and they might have trouble giving you useful results because they're looking at gray squares and just sitting there confused. That's a problem I've had before as well. Playtesting can get corrupted by unfinished or unpolished assets, which is kind of a catch-22 because you want to not polish those or spend the effort to polish those until you've actually got the design down. So yeah, that's not something I did a ton of. Maybe I should have done more of. But it's tricky when you're working in gray box like that, and especially it's hard to find playtesters on your own as well. So, but I do think it is potentially a very good antidote for some of the problems I was having.
Great, thank you. Another question now in from Tushar. He'd like to know, what kind of games should we make? Games which people like or games we like to play?
Well, I think by definition there's some overlap between those groups, since if you like to play them, then they're games which people like. I think this is a personal choice. There are definitely developers out there who, especially working for studios, who just make games that people want to play. I think that as creators we have some duty to pay attention to what people want, or people who aren't us, because ultimately we're not here to serve ourselves. This isn't some solipsistic exercise in creative self-gratification, or at least that's not the explicit purpose of it. You are there to help your players enjoy themselves. At the same time, I think it's potentially not a great idea to get into developing a game that you personally have no interest in. I think you have to have a little bit of fire in your belly, or ideally a lot, to pull out that edge that makes a good game great. If you really have no interest in what you're making, you might be able to do a decent job very by the numbers, but I have trouble believing that you're really going to create something fascinating, or you're really going to push boundaries. Now, there's no contradiction here. These two categories can overlap. All of us probably like lots of different games, and there are many different games that people like to play, and especially in the indie space, where you don't have to sell a ton of copies. You can make niche games and still find an audience that will support you. Find something that you like that you think people would like to play, and try to choose something that puts fire in your belly and that is not so utterly weird that nobody else would be interested in it. And I think you'll get the best of both worlds.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see here. A question from Yitzi. They'd like to know, survey pre-game conception. What percentage of women contribute or matter for stats to conception or design from your games?
I have to admit I don't fully understand the question. I want to make sure I understand this before. Could you clarify that and maybe come back with it?
Yeah, Yitzi, if you could let us know, like Tynan just said, clarify it a bit, and then we'll try to get that answered for you. All right, Sergey would like to know, how many projects have you scrapped during your career, and what has been the biggest factor in dropping these projects?
All right. Let's see here. Count them up. I showed you 3 today. I showed you Animus, Survival Stories, Wizard University. Besides that, I can count 2 indie projects in my mind that went a decent amount of time and scrapped. So we're counting 5, and probably add on a bunch more because, me personally, I've always been starting creative projects pretty much continuously since I was a kid. Some of them get finished, like the book got finished with O'Reilly. Elemental Conflict, that mod I showed you, got finished. A bunch of those levels got finished, and a lot don't. I think that ending up scrapping projects is a natural part of creative process, as long as you don't do it all the time, or just end up giving up and doing nothing all the time. For me, I'd probably scrap about half of the projects I start, whether they're levels or games. The thing that was worrying me recently was this phenomenon where I seem to be scrapping 3 to 4 game prototypes in a row, and that's when I really started getting concerned about whether I was being irrational about the process or coming at it the wrong way, and hence talking about emotion in game design. A lot of things just don't work out, especially in games. It's hard to solve problems without really making deep cuts, and I think really good games, a lot of the time the beauty in them does not come from detail work at the end where designers are solving problems piece by piece, but the beauty of it comes from, it falls out naturally from the fundamentals of those early design decisions. And if those, excellent game dynamics and really compelling play doesn't naturally fall out of those early decisions, then you're kind of in a bind. It's hard to solve problems after the fact, or oftentimes impossible. So it's natural to scrap things, especially in games. And I've scrapped a lot, and everyone's going to. As long as you don't scrap all the time, I think majority scrapping is probably pretty standard and appropriate.
Super. Thank you so much. A couple more questions here, and folks, we're going to take as many as we have time for. Another question, is game development lonely? And do you have any support network that when you're stuck or doubtful you can turn to? Is that internal or external organizationally?
Well, different kinds of game development can be differently lonely, right? I mean, I work in a studio where I'm surrounded by people all the time. So that's certainly not a lonely experience because you're interacting constantly. Independent game development, though, can be pretty lonesome. You know, I mean, you're sitting there, you're in your room, and especially if you're on your own, there's just no one around. In that way, it was very similar to the process of writing the book, which was also a pretty lonely process at the end of the day. I've read authors who talk about how to do that successfully, you really have to have a tolerance for solitude. I think the same could be said for independent game development, because if you really, really need people around to make you feel good, you're not going to be able to be successful at something that depends on you being alone for long periods of time. As for support networks, I think it's a really good idea to build a support network. Me personally, I mean, I have, my family's great. I have friends I talk to. I have old developer friends who I talk to. But, possibly I should have more. I think it's good to hook up with people. And this question is actually a reminder to me that I should probably be doing more of it. So, and hopefully a reminder to everybody else listening out there as well. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Just a couple more questions here. Peter would like to know, how many philosophical, psychological books do you read, and do you have any favorites?
I read a ton of philosophy psych, both because it's interesting and because I was writing a game design book, which is pretty related. I made a decision a few years ago just to start reading all over the place, everything I could find, just to harvest ideas or find metaphors, and it turned out to be a really good idea because I got to take all those ideas and feed them back into the book, even if they seemed unrelated. So actually, at the back of the game design book, I have a list of recommended readings, several of which are philosophy and psych books. See here, a couple of recommendations off the top of my head. The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb is really good. It talks about risk and prediction. His basic thesis is that the easily graphed and linearly predictable world that everyone pretends to live in when they're making forecasts of oil futures or company productivity is basically just a falsehood, and that everything interesting and consequential that happens in the world comes from these quote-unquote black swan events, which are fundamentally unpredictable events like, for example, in the world scale, September 11th would be a black swan. So would the invention of a nuclear bomb. On a personal or game development scale, meeting someone who turns out to be your future spouse could be your black swan event that just completely changes the course of your life. Or in game development, meeting or someone mentioning a game that you go and play, and then suddenly it inspires a totally new direction in your design. So that book is essentially about really understanding and emphasizing these fundamentally unpredictable events instead of always focusing on the slow linear progression that everyone's talking about most of the time. Other than that, see here, everything by Steven Pinker is great for psychology. That Progress Principle book I mentioned is really great. As I said, a bunch more in recommended things in the back of my book, Designing Games with O'Reilly.
Super. And with that, folks, we are at the top of the hour, so we are going to say a very big thank you to you, Tynan, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great time, and I hope you guys all enjoyed it and learned something useful. And once again, if anybody wants to contact me or talk about whatever, especially games, I'm tynansylvester.com, or you can email me at tynan.sylvester@gmail.com.
Super, folks. And as you can see on the slide there, he does have his contact information, so please do jot that down. I think based on lots of conversation I'm seeing in the group chat, many of you will be following up with him. Folks, thank you so much for attending our webcast today. We hope you've benefited and enjoyed the presentation. And again, yep, just from all the comments here, Tynan, people really did enjoy it. Very, very good comments. Folks that sent in your questions, thank you for sending in your questions, because having those questions just adds so much more to our events. We'd like to let you all know that we did push out a code in your group chat. So if you didn't open that group chat, please do open it. There's a code in there to save you some money today as a thank you for attending our webcast. Tynan's book, you can get it today for a really, really good price. If you like what you heard and what you saw today, you need to get the book. There's just so much more in there that is really going to help you with your day-to-day, so we definitely encourage you to do that. Again, we thank you, Tynan. We thank everyone for attending. This will conclude our webcast. Goodbye, everyone.